Can you just say, that's him there, he's an artist. Transformative Sustainable Futures at Finland Futures Research Center. Ooh. I'm getting giddy because I've had an apple. He's a systems scientist, a futurist, and an ecological economist. He's over 20 years experience across academic, government, and private roles. And I'm going to pass over to him. He will introduce the panel. And I'd just like to encourage everybody, I think we'll put up the QR code. There it is. If you can, if you have QR facility on your phone, use that and do feedback. I understand you want to listen in the middle of the session. But if there's anything that you want to add or contribute or sum up, either do it on the QR. If you don't have a QR code friendly smartphone, there is a long numbered code, but I can't remember where that is. If you, sure, there it is. We're all way ahead of you. And if that's too technical, there's bits of paper outside. You can write your thoughts. Please do that, because we do want as much of your feedback as possible. Okay, I will hand over now to Tadhg. Take it away. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nuala. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for coming today. It's wonderful to see a full house for such an important topic. The Rethinking Growth conference, I think we're getting a bit of feedback there, if we could, yeah. So, Rethinking Growth, this session is specifically to consider the tensions where there's convergence, where there's tensions and convergence in rethinking growth, specifically from President Michael D Higgins' reflections on economic goals from his TASC lecture last year. We have a really interesting, diverse panel. I'm going to invite them to come up first. So Dr. Shana Cohen is the director of the Think Tank for Action on Social Change, or TASC. Since 2017, in addition to her directorship, she works directly on projects involving social inclusion, economic inequality, democracy, and climate justice. So thank you, Shana Cohen. We have Dr. Michael Mulreany. Dr. Michael Mulreany is Deputy Director General of the Institute of Public Administration, where he directs undergraduate, postgraduate, and associated professional development programs, including the Professional Certificate in Climate Action and Sustainability Reporting. So, Dr. Michael Mulreany, please. We have also Dr. Darren Clarke. Dr. Darren Clarke is Assistant Professor in the School of History and Geography in Dublin City University. And his research focuses on climate adaptation, environmental policy, governance, health, well-being, and environmental psychology. Dr. Clarke. Finally, and not least, we have Paul Murphy, Choctadala for People Before Profit, representing the Dublin Southwest constituency. Paul is spokesperson on climate action for People Before Profit, and he's written in favor of eco-socialist degrowth in Rupture, the eco-socialist magazine. Thanks so much, Paul. We will also have, as I understand, David Bollier, an American activist, scholar, and blogger focused on the commons in a new paradigm for reimagining economics, politics, and culture. The director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. And I understand David is going to join us online. Hi. He's already here. Hi, David. Thanks for joining us. Okay. So, I thought a little bit about how we might frame this, this session, as it is specifically reflecting on the provocative address of President Higgins. We have a history now in Ireland for a few decades of quite provocative and quite progressive presidents who are using that position of power, that privilege in politics, to actually see how can we move towards progressive social change. President Higgins has continued this, and his contribution in terms of reflecting on economics and economic goals is quite academic in his style, but also quite pithy. I'm going to focus on some of the main points that came through. So he tracked a link between neoliberal economics and the neoliberal philosophy to an economics that has proliferated throughout the world that is focused on metrics such as GDP and quantification economic models, or how he termed it as a descriptive economics based on metrics. He saw this as a fallacy of description. This is quite a provocative statement to economics that we need to start reflecting more on our goals, on our processes, on our framings, and on the outcomes in real terms in society and environment. He focused on the ecological dystopia. So we are all quite familiar with the twin planetary crises, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crises, and President Higgins focused on a common driver of this is recognized as, or known as a mega driver. Economic growth drives consumption, and overconsumption is driving these two crises. It's also strongly linked to inequalities. So we have a growth in inequalities within societies, and this is also represented in terms of consumption levels. So we've had a lot of luxury consumption at the expense of basic needs consumption in the majority world. So that this challenge of how economics is reflected in our academia, in our analysis, in our research, and how that influences politics, that this is strongly related to this deepening inequality, which is playing out in politics and institutions and society with really significant consequences. Exploding inequalities with a massive deregulation and a globalization defined solely by trade densities. He also focused on the faith in this neoliberal approach, as in a faith in the efficiency of markets, superiority of markets to government intervention, and of the ability to markets to self-correct. And he advocated to this, to articulating this challenge of where many of the outcomes of economics are leading us. He advocated for a paradigm shift in how we approach economics and how economics actually affects our politics and our policies. That this would be a recovered political economy, a new ecological social model. And that this, I suppose, while there are political orthodoxies that somehow have a difficulty in actually speaking or discussing or debating these topics, in economics, it has been quite a strong debate for a number of decades that there is a difficulty in terms of how we apply economics that just quantifies and is removed from the moral philosophy that's there since Adam Smith. He was an economist and a moral philosopher, and that to reclaim this is an important part of how you reconnect an economics with something like a well-being economy, that you move away from an economics where economic growth is the ends, where it is just the means. And President Higgins was eager to point towards this. But where it gets more interesting, rather than just those, I suppose, controversial aspects which maybe pique the interests of some of the economists who have developed these approaches throughout their careers. He emphasized some of the, I suppose, positive aspects that we can focus on. Participative decision-making models. Defining our need for belonging. A new social contract to actually see how we could move towards sustainability and well-being. He has used, I suppose, some words that could pique some interest in what would we regard as what is rethinking growth, what is well-being. Artistic creation, human connection, solidarity, the seeking of harmony, of love in our lives, given our existence at what is called, I have called, migrants in our time. He also asked some rhetorical questions. Do we want a society committed to promoting decent, dignified standards for human labor? Do we want a society where children and the elderly are provided with adequate care, where people with disabilities and their families can avail of appropriate support? Do we want to bequeath to our children an Ireland where everybody will have access to nutritious food, clean water, adequate housing, good health care, childcare and education, irrespective of their ability to pay for these basic social goods? So this is, I suppose, quite provocative in terms of the economics, but quite provocative also in terms of how we could articulate a set of new economic goals. What are the goals of societies and the goals of economies? I'll invite the speakers maybe now from left to right to give their address of 4 to 6 minutes.
Okay, I aimed for 3, but that's fine. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Shana Cohen, and I'm the director of TASC. So I got to hear the speech, see the speech live, because that was at our reception. So very quickly, I enjoyed listening to the speech. I have one criticism that I'll explain in very, very briefly. I enjoyed the fact that he cited Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, which is a favorite book of mine. I think he's right to focus it back on categories of how we think about human existence. And he was talking about the difference between labor, which is how you survive, but also how you are happy because you do labor together. And it creates a sense of belonging and solidarity, and work, which allows you to create something, to have an impact in the world. And then the last one is action, activity, which is political life, which he didn't talk about as much explicitly. But what he points to, which I'm a bit critical of, is he's tying it back to the market economy and a critique of the market economy. Actually, I'm studying the far right quite a lot right now, and if you keep repeating the same vocabulary of the far right, you just glorify the far right. So I'm a bit suspicious about continuing to focus just on the market rather than the institutions that sustain solidarity, belonging, create human fulfillment, which comes out of work, and political life, which for me is connecting the market with government, institutions, and civil society. And it's not mimicking the vocabulary of market growth, well-being necessarily, without framing it in an alternative paradigm. And I guess that was my point, because the ultimate goal for me is to protect the institutions that allow all those things together, and to allow conferences like this, which is democracy. So if you don't have a democratic system that you're interacting in, then you can't have conferences like this and actually question the vocabulary that policymakers are using.
So I'm going to actually start off by saying I think we have the youngest degrowth person in the room. A little baby was here earlier on. I think she was, or he or she was a couple of months old, which is nice to see. I'm going to take it from probably focus on the convergence, where some things have converged, or certainly where I see some things have converged. I mean, if we look at well-being economies, one of the underlying features of well-being economies and where they started is it was usually female-led. And I certainly believe, I mean, if we look at history and politics and who has been leading economic growth, it's largely been men. And I think genuinely, if we're to have a serious discussion on well-being economics, more women need to be in politics, is a definite view. And I think that's seen from the likes of the Scottish, the Icelandic, the Finnish prime ministers that set up this well-being economy idea. And without that caring attitude, that solidarity that women have, I think that's a key thing that I think history has taught us that obviously men just don't seem capable of trying to figure out when it comes to economic growth, and thinking that that's certainly it seems to be the only way, or it has been for centuries, or a century or so. So that's my first point. My second point is I'm conscious that I'm sitting beside Paul Murphy to the left of me, but I genuinely think around convergence, I think what politics has shown us in the last month or two, and what it may show us in France in a couple of weeks' time, is there's convergence, or certainly a move to the right, and the right have their ideology of what they want. And for 100 years, there was an ideology that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in an Irish context were so different to one another, but when it came to politics in the last election, they were very much ideologically the same. And I see a huge gap, if we're talking about well-being economics, I see a huge gap on the left political parties, to figure out how they're going to tell a story to the public about what well-being economics looks like for them. Because if you look at their policies, if you look at what they're, whether it's the People Before Profit or whether it's Green Party or whether it's Soc Dems, they all largely have the same values around equality, around fairness, around redistributing wealth fairly, all of these things. And I think genuinely, if we're to have a serious discussion about well-being economics, I think that will have to come from the left. We've had 100 years of centre-right or right, and it hasn't come from them. So I think it's most likely, and if you look at even those leaders in those countries, the women and the leaders of those countries, they were largely left-leaning governments. So I really feel that if there's a serious discussion around convergence of ideas around this, it needs to come from the left, and it needs to be a cohesive effort rather than different political parties having different views on the same things effectively, as I see it. And I think that came up as Sean mentioned it in the first discussion. And lastly, just one thing around convergence, and it's beginning to happen, is the idea of a universal basic income. We have a trial of this in Ireland with artists, and I think if we're serious about rolling out a well-being economy, universal basic income that has been shown to work in other countries, I think that will genuinely need to be a larger part of the discussion around a well-being economy.
Yeah, I mean, I just came from the Dáil, and the Dáil is a funny place because the majority of politicians in the Dáil will tell you that they do not have an ideology. And they'll say that very, very proudly, that they don't have an ideology. And that gets to the core of what makes an effective ideology. An effective ideology is one that you don't notice that you're in. It's like the fish who doesn't know that there's a thing called water because they just live in the water. An effective ideology is one that is simply common sense. It's one that is simply the way things are. And that's kind of genuinely how Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael politicians think they are. They think that's just being pragmatic, being in favor of neoliberal policies. That's just the thing that makes sense from the point of view of the economy or whatever. And I think a useful thing in Michael D Higgins's speeches is to point to the ideology of growthism that is absolutely prevalent in our societies. More prevalent than neoliberalism, I would say, and kind of underlying and related to neoliberalism, but even more prevalent, even less questioned up until recently, I would say. Because obviously, and he rightly aims fire at neoliberalism, but we should be honest that I would say 10 years ago, many of us here, trade unionists, progressive academics, socialist political parties, would have been using phrases like sustainable growth. You'll still find a lot of trade unions using phrases like sustainable growth, progressive, think tanks, and so on. It's still out there, and it speaks to the extraordinary prevalence and power of the ideology of growthism, which is the idea that, well, if there is growth in the economy, whether measured as GDP or, because you can get a bit technical there, like even separate from that, growth in the amount of stuff that we use, material throughput, what we take out of the earth, growth in the amount of energy that we use, that will translate into a better life for people. So we all agree that there needs to be more energy used. It's just a question of how that is organized and how that is distributed. And I think we need to reject that. I think those of us on the socialist left need to reject it, and the trade union movement need to reject it, and the ecological movements need to reject it, in academia and so on, need to reject it. And I think we need to replace it with a sense of buen vivir, the good life, and advocate for things that make people's lives better, and try and separate that from the notion of growth. Just one thing on that, and I think maybe a weakness or whatever that I'd like, if I had the chance, I'd discuss further with Michael D Higgins, is that ideology of growthism or the ideology of neoliberalism, it doesn't come from nowhere. It's not up there in academia, it just won the argument. It is moored in material realities and material interests. So again, the people who advocated for neoliberalism, they were working on it for quite a while, and then the moment struck where it made sense for capitalism, it served a function for capitalism. Capitalism hit a crisis of profitability, and then we needed to privatize everything and seek new markets and commodify everything, etc. But similarly, I would argue that growthism is intimately connected to capitalism. Capitalism is a system based on private ownership, the means of production, and everyone pursues their own individual profit without regard for the impact on society at large, be it humans or non-human nature. And like, fundamentally, I don't think you get away from growthism, and you don't get away from the barbarism that we are sinking into in terms of ecological catastrophe, the rise of the far right, the threat of very serious international war, without breaking from that capitalist system. So it isn't just about what language you use or how we measure the economy. It's a question, I'm sure people here, or some people here know the Walter Benjamin quote about, Marx says that revolutions are the locomotives of world history, but maybe it's different. Maybe revolutions are humanity pulling the emergency brake. The question is how to build a force that is actually able to pull the brake, because otherwise we know, we're doomed, in quite a short space of time, and we're not in a particularly good shape right now. And so just to finish on that, in terms of, I think these ideas can be popular. I don't think this has to be, they like to present it that this is austerity, you're promising people austerity. But actually, public luxury, working a lot less, having high quality, durable, repairable goods, not being bombarded by advertising, not spending money on the military, having free, frequent public transport, having retrofitted homes, using less energy, having a better life, and leaving room for more energy to be used in the global south, and using less energy in the global north. But that can be a popular idea, but fundamentally, I don't see it happening if the economy is in private ownership. We're not going to be able to plan such a transition unless we have public ownership. In my opinion, that is a necessary but not sufficient condition. We have had economies dominated by public ownership in the past, and that were also ecologically catastrophic. So it's necessary but insufficient. What it needs to be married to is genuine democracy and a knowledge and an awareness about the ecological catastrophe that we face. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me here today. I just say a few quick words, if that's okay. If you look at President Higgins' speech, I just want to focus in on one or two issues, and Tadhg gave a very good summary of them. But he accused, I think that's a reasonable phrase, economics of being an empty discipline and a discipline blinkered to the ecological challenge. So I in turn would like to challenge that just a little bit. And I think that's the purpose of debate, and I think that's what he was trying to provoke probably in the first place. Economics actually, I won't go into technical details, has made an enormous contribution to the meeting ecological challenge. So I could pick out, for example, the work of Partha Dasgupta, who has factored nature into the way we look at what we call production functions, how we generate economic growth, and made the distinction between the stock of capital that nature has and the flows of GDP. I could pick out the brilliant work of William Nordhaus, who got a Nobel Prize for his work that traces through the idea of how emissions are linked to temperature rises and how temperature rises are related to economic growth, and paces out a number of scenarios. That's where we actually got the 2% warming limit that is put forward, comparing us to pre-industrial times. I could pick out the work of Nicholas Stern, who's looked at economic costs over the next 100 years. But I don't want that to be over defensive, but I do think it's important to register it. I was asked to really think about a few things in terms of looking at economic models and the role of economics on the curriculum, because that was also in President Higgins' speech. President Higgins actually said we need to get proper thinking about economics and the environment into curricula. I think he may have mentioned the first year of universities, but he certainly mentioned it in terms of university curricula. So just a few thoughts about that. My own view is that for many, many, many years, people have been working on alternative measures to GDP. And by the way, the debate on growth very often becomes a debate about GDP, and they're actually different things, and we should separate them out. The actual technical measurement is different from the debate on growth, which leads back to innovation and population growth and things like that, though they are related. But to that, I would add a number of things. We need a fuller dashboard, a dashboard which isn't just the measurement of growth, but also is about longevity, or what I prefer, down to an individual basis, is the median income of households. It's a much more understandable thing for people. I would add two things to that. So I don't have radical alternatives to growth models, but I have some radical, what could I call them, complementarities. I really think that economics should be taught with things such as governance and strategy. So we know, for example, that good governance, in other words, just to make it clear, proper checks and balances in our society, reduced corruption, the whole idea of, I suppose, having a system which is much more human. I do think that looking down those lines, we have a better dashboard, good governance, and that's related statistically to better growth. So openness, transparent administration, and so on and so forth. I think that's important. The problem with economics is it's not taught in the business faculties enough. Even in this university, economics is not contained within the business faculty. It should have more connections. It does have some. But if we could link those things, I think that would be a big step. Also to strategy. I'm working with a state body at present in their strategy where they're trying to get the younger people in the organization to actually formulate the first draft of their strategy. And they're finding, of course, that younger people have a deeper connection to the things that really matter in the modern world, the various things such as social justice, impact on the environment, very conscious about their consumption and so on and so forth. And I think if that connection was made, we'd be in a far, far better place. Okay, and by the way, can I finally say, growth is not a bad thing. It can be a bad thing. The Potsdam Institute this year is saying that the wrong kind of growth could drive down global GDP by 20%. So that's pretty grim. But on the other hand, growth has given us wonderful things as well. It's pulled over 500 million people out of poverty in Asia. We know that, for example, if people grow from close to zero income to $15,000 per capita, $15,000, which is not a lot, their life expectancy goes up by about 30 years, infant mortality goes down, maternal morbidity goes down. So I would say that the big issue for me is to balance the good things in growth and get the right kind of growth, to be honest, Okay, that's my pitch.
Thank you so much to the speakers for giving their very pithy observations in such a short space of time. It's always a challenge. I think we can see that there are tensions. I think that's an inevitable result of what President Higgins actually set out to do. I think there's a lot of value in actually having difficult conversations sometimes, but also convergence, and that word was mentioned. It's in the title of what we're looking at today in terms of this session. Often when people speak about well-being, it comes down to recognizing that there are multiple dimensions, and people from many different cultures, many different political ideologies will often point to similar aspects. So maybe if I ask the panel if you could identify maybe one or two priorities that you think would be important for a well-being economy from your perspective. So if I start with Shana.
I'd say that oh, sorry, I forgot about that. Sorry about that. So I would, my first would be based on I can see my staff are here, from the People's Transition. We have this project that President Higgins cited in his speech that connects climate justice with community development. And the priority, I don't know quite how you measure it, but it's being heard. And that's why I'm a bit skeptical about the focus. Growth is really great. Now, I don't think growth is a bad thing necessarily, but we work in communities that don't see the benefits of growth. And so is the response to just measure median income, or is it to measure different aspects of being able to control your life? And so I think that is something that people don't feel like they have any control over their life, and that nobody is listening to them. And there are measures within that that are not, there are measures within that that aren't being connected to the infrastructure that's in the community, like the social infrastructure. And the consequence could be, like, just in one community we're working in, malnourishment, very profound food poverty, high rates of crime, drug abuse, et cetera. So I think if you're really going to tackle the question of rethinking growth, then you have to start in the communities that really need growth and ask what kinds of measures and what kinds of interventions. And then again, it's the connection, situating the economy within a larger social and political infrastructure. And that's what those communities really need.
So I think for me, I think some of the key things I talked about, I think, is priorities is two that I would have at the top of my head is more women in politics, and the second would be the left coming together. But aside from that, I think what Paul mentioned, moving from privatization to publicization, if we want to talk about the core things that keep us well in an economy, and that is our healthcare service, that's our housing, that's our education. It's all the fundamentals that we should have a right to, and they should function well, and they should be in public ownership. That to me is a prerequisite for a well-being economy, a good, and if we look at some of the more socialist countries in the Nordic countries in particular, those kind of things are in public ownership, or largely in public ownership, and they tend to work much better than in places like Ireland. So that's one of my recommendations. I mean, I go back to Julia Steinberger has published work with Jason Hickel, who's a very, very well-known degrowth person, and he's identified 5 basic things that we need to do. And one of those is ending planned obsolescence of goods, cutting advertising, the idea that we constantly have a shortfall or a deficiency in our lives because advertising tells us we have. It's absolutely nonsense. Shift from ownership to usership. So we don't need to own certain things. Our cars probably sit idle for 99% of the time. Do we all need a car? I'm put my hand up and say I own one, but 99% of the time I don't use it. And the last one is scale down destructive industries. We calculate GDP, capitalism, or GDP as everything from deforestation to overfishing as contributing to growth. They shouldn't count.
I agree with all of that. Yeah, I think they're all really good. Maybe 2 examples of like concrete things that I think. So I think you have to think about it politically. I don't mean party politically, but in the sense of what can help mobilize an agent for change, and mobilize, from my perspective, like working class people, broadly defined, against those in charge in a like ecologically sensitive, like fundamentally, and from my perspective, and this is a debate within People for Profit, but informed by degrowth, eco-socialist degrowth perspective. And kind of starting points for that, I think one, we introduced a bill to ban fossil fuel advertising maybe a year ago. Some people here were involved in doing work around it and stuff, and we're still campaigning on it. And then obviously the UN Secretary General came out just, 2 or 3 weeks ago calling for a ban. And I think it's a good thing to campaign on, because it targets a very obvious, like, powerful evil in our society, which is fossil fuel corporations, who are still enormously powerful. The lie of green growth and green capitalism is that, don't worry, there's this new high-tech and renewable sector coming that's going to become the most powerful. But like, investment in fossil fuels continues to go up, even though renewables are going up, because overall energy usage is expanding and they continue to have enormous political power. So actually targeting them, I think, is useful. And secondly, I think it gets us into the conversation about advertising, because I think, like, exactly as just been said, like, advertising creates all these artificial wants. We need to free people from advertising so that we can discover people's real wants, which are currently covered up by all this crap that you're like told that you need, and that And I actually think that's a conversation you can have with people on the doorstep that people understand. Like people are on their phones getting all these ads for like Temu or whatever, and just like random crap that is just pushed on people in an extreme way. So I think that's a useful kind of edge issue into that. And then the second thing, maybe in terms of like a positive demand, I think the building of a national health service, the building of a national free at the point of use childcare service. We should see them as climate demands. And these are low carbon jobs, extremely low carbon jobs that have a big positive impact in society. And again, in terms of like, it's not going to add to your GDP by a whole lot, but it's going to improve people's lives. It gives people that image of like, okay, what is it to have a better society? And again, highly feminized professions, significantly low paid professions. So the idea of like emphasizing that a caregiving society, a society that invests like much more substantially in those sort of things.
Okay, just a few thoughts that I have on this. First of all, the obvious thing to me, at least, in terms of improving well-being is to tackle the inequality areas. If you just look at the distribution of income and its tendency to be concentrated in the top quartile, in point of fact, the top decile, in point of fact, the top 1%, it's extraordinary how that's been allowed to happen without policy interventions and political interventions, but there are reasons. So that's the first thing. I read a book called The Economics of Enough by Diane Coyle, and it makes me think a lot. So I mentioned before that if you move from about, $10 a year to $15,000 per year, and $15,000, as I said before, is not a lot. You really have massive effects on not only longevity, participation in education, happiness actually is called. Over about 60,000, the level at which you become happier, so to speak, declines. And is there a way that one could see to figure that out? But that would need some sort of meta global governance to factor, and way beyond my pay grade. The second thing I would look at is, it'd be wonderful, because we keep talking about GDP. It'd be wonderful, for example, if we could find a way, people have been working on it, very good people for generations, of having a GDP which is adjusted for environmental damage, something like just a single figure green GDP, and that would focus government attention on policies to tackle that. And finally, I'm going to sneak in a third one. I think there's a need for policy coherence. In this country, we subsidize measures to move away from fossil fuels, but we also subsidize fossil fuels. So something wrong there, I think.
I think we can take a reflection from Christophe Bollier now, if we can, please. David Bollier, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Well, I probably have too much to say in 4 to 6 minutes, but first of all, I think this is an immensely important conversation to think about how we can move forward in more constructive ways to limit growth. I come from a somewhat different perspective in that I've been studying the commons as an alternative paradigm of culture and economics and politics for the past 20 years or more. And I've come to conclude that really the market state itself is part of the problem. The state is so allied with capital and the objectives of capitalism that it's hard to achieve the necessary breakthrough perspectives and gains that we want to through the state, given the current ideological spectrum and habits of policy and law. So much of my thinking has been about the commons as a parallel polis, to use Václav Havel's word, as a way to develop a different sort of relationality that can jump the tracks of really capitalist modernity, which itself stands for the supremacy of the individual over collective interests, homo economicus as the standard model. It posits the modern belief that humans are separate from nature and that the earth is essentially non-living and inert. It asserts the belief that science and rationality are really the superior to other forms of knowledge, the kind of subjectivity that comes through emotions or situated life, or even tacit knowledge or traditions. And it also believes in the sense of the present isolated from history or future generations. I see the commons as kind of an antidote to this in a not just a notional, intellectual, or philosophical way, but as a practical vehicle, as seen in countless diverse types of commons, from community-supported agriculture to open source software to Wikipedia and the dozens of, or scores of different types of online collaborative communities, the mutual aid networks, the socially minded cooperatives, agroecology, and one could go on in many, many dimensions. I wrote a book called The Commoner's Catalog for Changemaking on the basis of the Whole Earth Catalog to sort of retail how much is actually going on, but is not culturally visible or legible because we simply do not have the language to talk about this relationality and to talk about this, the different forms of value that are created that capitalist economics simply doesn't recognize, because something's valuable only if there's market exchange and has a price within standard economics. But there's all sorts of value created from care work performed by families and women, as mentioned by one of the panelists, the eco-stewardship that people do, especially in indigenous and traditional communities, the socially committed cooperatives, the artistic and academic gift economies, lots of bioregional and local currencies, and many other things. The point is that commons create value. This value is simply not recognized. We haven't developed the language, the vocabularies, the social logics for making that visible. And I think until a lot of these things happen, which, well, they are sort of happening right now through the growth of the commonsverse, we will not be able to pierce the rather famous capacity of capitalism to co-opt and shapeshift and evade some of its core dynamics for capital growth and accumulation. So I see the commons as a way that we can start to do this. And I might just add, in response to the comment about belonging and community and well-being, the commons has something to contribute that the left is not really putting forward in terms of vehicles for having individual agency in a time when there's so much distrust and alienation, especially with the state and capital predatory markets. I think that commons are a vehicle for social reconstruction because they provide people with genuine capacities for contributing creativity and commitment in ways that are meaningful to their meeting their needs through certain forms of provisioning. And universal basic income could be an enormous help in providing a floor of livelihoods and subsistence from which people can then begin to contribute in ways that are not recognized by the market. So I just put this on the table as part of the discussion for broadening the discussion beyond some of the standard ideological frames, which, I don't want to say this is an either-or proposition. I just want to say that there are distinct limits to existing ideological affordances that we need to get beyond, and understanding the ontology and language that are necessary for opening it up, the possibilities, I think is an important part of this conversation.
Thanks so much to David for joining us online today, and for the panelists. This is, I suppose, I think President Higgins, in addition to being somewhat provocative towards pushing forward that debate, that discussion, he's also, I suppose, framed it in a way that leads almost into quite academic conversations in some aspects. But there are also aspects that come, I suppose, that emerge from that in things that we can start to focus on in terms of a vision, in terms of things that actually can be common interests, even across different ideologies. So if I was to focus on just some of the aspects that came through from the contributions today, Shana, for example, focused on language, the importance of language, and also the importance of community, so that it comes through particularly in things like tensions, because there are, of course, deep tensions in terms of how society is operating, how economies are operating, what's the outcomes of that, who is it for. Darren focused on convergence, and also, I suppose, the politics of the how. Paul also, to some degree, focused on that, the how of how can we achieve things. Also was somewhat critical of growthism alongside neoliberalism as being a barrier, but also articulated some of the things that we might find important. And he used the phrase public luxury, that you might have these public goods, these things that we can all share, or even things that we privately share. The importance of community, family, and friends in our lives will come through in many different well-being frameworks is really, really important. Michael emphasized the positive contribution of economics. Some of the studies that have been done, for example, by Partha Dasgupta on returning a value of nature within standard production functions, and also pointed to important things such as a policy coherence, so that you start to bring together goals that can reinforce each other and can achieve win-win outcomes. David also then focused on the state as part of the problem, capitalist modernity, and really, I suppose, impressed upon us the importance of the common and cooperatives. And I think it's not something we are going to fully resolve today. There will be those tensions, different worldviews, different values, different ways of framing and looking at problems, and even looking at results when it comes to analysis or putting forward policies. But there are often common elements that do come through, and I hope some of that came through for you today. There are common aspects that we can, maybe there's sometimes it is important to do that constructive disagreement, to acknowledge that we do sometimes view things differently, but often there are really important things that we all acknowledge that are important. And I think that goes back to the importance of that rethinking economies for well-being. We did actually get a lot of questions, but I know that there's a packed agenda for today. We want to get on to the next session. There were a number of really interesting questions that came through. I don't think we're going to quite have the time to pose it to the panel. It's such a topic that does, I suppose, generate a lot of reflection, and to give everyone the time, I think will put us beyond. But some of the thoughts that came through with public and social models of ownership alongside existing and new forms of community ownership, including cooperatives. So this would speak back to David's point. So again, these are the reflections from the audience through the Mentimeter. And hard to move away from growth. Business is always talking about expansion and selling more. And I think that reflects on some of the points that came through from the panel in terms of critiquing and criticizing consumption, but also in terms of the last panel, that aspect of the capture of politics and policy was referred to. So thanks so much to everyone for coming today. I'd like to give a round of applause to the panel for